Thursday mornings in Portland were supposed to be peaceful. After 40 years of working as an emergency room nurse, navigating the chaotic symphony of heart monitors, sirens, and desperate cries, I had learned to cherish the absolute stillness of my retirement. I was 62 years old, a widow living in a sprawling, slightly overgrown estate on the edge of the city, where the persistent Oregon rain usually provided the only soundtrack to my days. The house felt entirely too large for just two people, but it was still home. My husband, David, had passed away over a decade ago, leaving behind a silence that I eventually learned to tolerate. But the silence left behind by my youngest son, Lucas, was a suffocating weight that had never truly lifted. He had vanished 9 years ago, to disappearing one stormy November night at the age of 21, leaving behind nothing but an empty bedroom, unanswered questions, and a hollow ache in my chest that defied every medical remedy I knew. Now it was just me and Chloe, my eldest daughter, 35, brilliant, fiercely driven, and undeniably successful. She had transformed the massive vintage glass greenhouse attached to the back of our property into a high-end terrarium and eco-landscape design studio. She had built a thriving business that catered to the city's elite, creating miniature, self-sustaining worlds encased in glass. She had left for a client consultation downtown at 7 o'clock that morning, just like she did every Thursday, kissing my cheek and reminding me to keep the thermostat steady. The estate was empty, save for myself and Marcus. A local plumber I had hired to inspect a persistent leak near the foundation of the greenhouse. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring myself a second cup of decaf and watching the steady drizzle blur the outline of the Douglas firs in the backyard, when I saw Marcus emerge from the side entrance of the greenhouse. He was a stout, methodical man who had been fixing our pipes for over 5 years, the kind of professional who never spoke unless it was absolutely necessary. Through the rain-streaked window, I noticed he wasn't carrying his toolbox. He was wiping his hands on a greasy rag, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, looking back over his shoulder at the heavy glass doors of the structure. He walked up the back porch steps and knocked lightly on the kitchen door. I set my mug down on the granite counter. Decades in the hospital wards had conditioned me to recognize the subtle tension in someone's posture when they were carrying bad news. I opened the door, letting in a gust of damp, pine-scented air. "Did you find the source of the leak, Marcus?" I asked, pulling my knitted cardigan tighter around my shoulders. Marcus didn't meet my eyes right away. He twisted the rag in his hands, shifting his weight from one work boot to the other. "Mrs. Evelyn," he began, his voice dropping to a careful, apologetic whisper, the exact tone people use when they are terrified of upsetting you. "I don't want to alarm you. I really don't. But I was down near the main drainage valve, right by the concrete foundation of the greenhouse, and there is something out here I think you need to hear." My hand went numb around the edge of the doorframe. "What do you mean?" I asked, a sudden, inexplicable dread creeping up my spine, mirroring the chill of the morning air. Marcus stepped a little closer, lowering his voice even more, as if the rain itself might be listening. "There's a sound," he said softly, coming from beneath the concrete floor. At first, I thought it was just water hammering in the pipes, but it's too rhythmic. It's a tapping, a steady, deliberate tapping, and there's a hum beneath it. I swear to you, Mrs. Evelyn, it sounds exactly like someone playing a cello down there, very low, very faint, but it's there." The breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. The world around me seemed to tilt, the familiar shapes of my kitchen blurring at the edges. A cello. Lucas was a cellist, a prodigy, David used to say. His music used to fill every corner of this house, deep, mournful, and incredibly beautiful. When he vanished, the silence that replaced his music was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. For 9 years, I had prayed to hear that sound again. "Show me," I managed to say, my voice barely more than a dry rasp. I followed Marcus out into the rain, my slippers soaking instantly in the wet grass. We entered the greenhouse. The air inside was thick, humid, and smelled intensely of damp earth, crushed ferns, and exotic orchids. It was Chloe's domain, meticulously organized. Massive wooden workbenches spanned the center of the room, covered in glass globes, specialized soil mixtures, tweezers, and miniature landscaping tools. The space was beautiful, but today it felt strangely oppressive. Marcus led me to the far corner, near the reinforced concrete base that supported the heavy irrigation tanks. "Down here," he whispered, gesturing to a grated drainage vent set into the floor. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the dampness seeping through my trousers. I pressed my ear close to the cold metal grate, closing my eyes and holding my breath. At first, there was only the ambient hum of the grow lights and the steady drip of condensation falling from the glass ceiling. But then, underneath it all, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic, desperate cadence, and weaving through those taps, a low, resonant vibration. It was faint, muffled by layers of earth and stone, but it was unmistakable. It was the deep, vibrating moan of cello strings, being bowed with agonizing slowness. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. It was a sound I had not heard in 9 years. "You hear it, don't you?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide with genuine concern. I couldn't answer. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling violently. I needed to think. I needed to find a rational explanation before my grieving mother's heart shattered all over again. I began to pace the length of the workbenches, my eyes scanning the pristine environment Chloe maintained. That was when I noticed the details that didn't belong. On the edge of the furthest table, partially hidden behind a large, half-finished terrarium, sat a ceramic mug. I reached out and touched it. The porcelain was warm. Not hot, but definitely warm, holding the distinct heat of recently poured coffee. I stared at the wall clock. It was 8:40 in the morning. Chloe had left the house at 7. There was no one else here. I picked up the mug, noticing a small puddle of condensation beneath it. Someone had been drinking this within the last 20 minutes. As I lifted the cup, another sensation hit me, sharp and entirely out of place in a botanical sanctuary. It was a smell. I inhaled deeply, my nursing instincts flaring to life. Beneath the heavy fragrance of wet soil and blooming jasmine, there was a faint, biting chemical odor. Isopropyl alcohol, medical-grade antiseptic. I had spent 40 years scrubbing my hands with that exact scent. Why would Chloe have surgical antiseptic in a greenhouse meant for cultivating moss and ferns? I stood frozen, holding the warm mug, the scent of the hospital burning in my nostrils, while the faint, rhythmic tapping continued beneath my feet. I was losing my mind. I had to be. Before I could process another thought, the heavy crunch of gravel echoed from the driveway. Car doors slammed. Crisp, purposeful footsteps approached the greenhouse. The heavy glass door swung open, and Chloe stepped inside, shaking the rain from her designer trench coat. She stopped dead in her tracks, genuine surprise flickering across her perfectly made-up face as she took in the scene. Me, pale and shaking, holding a coffee mug, and Marcus the plumber standing awkwardly near the drainage vent. "Mom? Marcus? What's going on?" Chloe asked, her voice smooth and melodic, betraying nothing but mild confusion. Marcus cleared his throat, twisting his rag again. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Chloe. I was just checking the foundation leak, and, well, I heard a sound coming from under the floor. It sounded like tapping, maybe even music." Chloe let out a light, effortless laugh that echoed sharply against the glass walls. "Oh my goodness, is that what this is about?" She walked over, placing a comforting hand on my trembling arm. Her touch was icy cold from the rain. "Mom, you look terrified. It's just the new automated hydroponic pump. I had it installed last week to regulate the water pressure for the rare orchids. The main filtration membrane gets jammed sometimes, and it makes this awful rhythmic thumping noise. It echoes through the PVC pipes under the concrete, making it sound almost like an instrument. I'm so sorry it scared you. Marcus's tense shoulders immediately relaxed. A jammed filter. Right. That makes perfect sense, actually. Sound travels weirdly through these underground pipes. My apologies, Mrs. Evelyn. I didn't mean to spook you. It's perfectly fine. Marcus, Chloe said, her smile radiant and unwavering. I appreciate you being so thorough. Actually, I forgot my portfolio binder for my 9 o'clock pitch, which is why I rushed back. I'll have the technician come out tomorrow to fix the pump. She moved to her desk, retrieved a sleek leather binder, and turned back to us, apologizing once more for the confusion. Within minutes, she was back in her car, her tires crunching against the gravel as she disappeared down the driveway. Marcus packed up his tools, satisfied with the explanation, and promised to return next week to finish sealing the exterior leak. I watched his truck pull away from the kitchen window. I was entirely alone again. The house was silent. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass. I walked back into the greenhouse. I stood by the workbench and stared at the spot where the coffee mug had been. Chloe's explanation was flawless. It was logical, mechanical, and perfectly reasonable. It was the kind of explanation that allowed a person to go back to their quiet, comfortable life. But as I stood there, inhaling the lingering ghost of medical antiseptic, my hands began to shake all over again. Chloe had said she rushed back for her portfolio, but when she walked in, she hadn't been carrying a coffee. The mug I had touched was warm before she even pulled into the driveway, and a jammed water pump, no matter how much it echoed through PVC pipes, did not sound like the mournful, heartbreaking vibration of a cello string being played in the dark. I closed my eyes, and from deep beneath the concrete floor, I heard it once more. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to believe my daughter. God knows I wanted to believe her. But the warm coffee and the smell of the hospital were telling a different story entirely, and for the first time in 9 years, I realized the terrifying truth. My home was hiding something I was never meant to find. The rest of the morning stretched out in an agonizingly slow crawl. The rain kept beating against the windows of the estate, but the rhythmic drumming only served to remind me of the tapping beneath the greenhouse floor. I tried to distract myself with my usual routine. I folded laundry. I wiped down the kitchen counters. I even tried reading a novel in the sitting room, but my eyes kept drifting toward the heavy glass doors at the back of the house. The scent of isopropyl alcohol seemed to cling to my clothes, and the phantom vibration of a cello string echoed in my ears. I knew I should let it go. Chloe had given me a perfectly rational explanation. A jammed hydroponic pump. It made sense. But 40 years of nursing had taught me to trust my gut over a convenient diagnosis. My gut was screaming that something was terribly wrong. I needed proof. I needed to know if I was losing my mind to grief, or if my daughter was hiding something unimaginable right beneath my feet. I waited until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Chloe had texted me around noon to say she was grabbing lunch with a landscape architect and wouldn't be home until 6. That gave me 5 hours. 5 hours to either confirm my worst fears or prove myself a paranoid, grieving old woman. I made my way down the hallway to Chloe's home office. The room used to be David's study, a place of worn leather armchairs and the smell of pipe tobacco. Chloe had completely transformed it when she moved her business headquarters into the house. Now it was a shrine to modern minimalism. A sleek glass desk sat in the center, flanked by towering white bookshelves filled with texts on botany, sustainable agriculture, and business management. Everything was pristine, curated, and intimidatingly organized, much like Chloe herself. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. Invading my daughter's privacy felt like a betrayal, but the memory of that warm coffee mug pushed me forward. I walked behind the glass desk and approached the tall, white filing cabinet tucked into the corner. I pulled the handle of the bottom drawer. It wasn't locked. It slid open smoothly on its tracks, revealing rows of meticulously labeled folders: business licenses, vendor contracts, tax returns. I bypassed them all, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed over the manila tabs until I found a thick accordion folder labeled Household and Miscellaneous Expenditures. I pulled the heavy folder out and carried it to the glass desk, spreading the contents across the immaculate surface. There were hundreds of receipts, clipped together by month, spanning back several years. I expected to find invoices for exotic plant soils, specialized glass containers, or perhaps expensive dinners with clients. Instead, as I unclipped a stack from early last year, I found long, itemized supermarket receipts: Costco, Target, Fred Meyer. I picked one up at random. A Target receipt dated April 14th, 2 years ago, and the total was over $300. I scanned the itemized list, my eyes widening as I read. There were groceries, of course: chicken breasts, rice, oatmeal, canned vegetables. But then came the other items: Gillette Mach 3 razor blades, 3 cans of Barbasol shaving cream, a 6-pack of Hanes men's crew socks, size large, a 5-pound tub of Optimum Nutrition whey protein powder, and at the very bottom, 3 bottles of high-dose vitamin D, 3 supplements. I stared at the slip of paper, my mind struggling to process the information. Chloe was a single 35-year-old woman. She lived alone with me. She didn't have a boyfriend, at least not one she had brought around in the last 5 years since Julian moved away. She certainly didn't own any pets. So why was she buying men's shaving cream? Why was she buying men's large socks? And the protein powder? Chloe was naturally slender and only did light yoga. She had never touched a protein shake in her life. I pulled another receipt from a different month. A Costco trip. $420. More bulk groceries, more razor blades, men's deodorant, and again, the high-dose vitamin D supplements. My hands began to shake uncontrollably as I pulled out my phone and opened the calculator app. I started tallying the totals from the bottom of each receipt, going back month by month, year by year. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent. Every 2 to 3 weeks, Chloe was making massive supply runs. I added the numbers together, my breath catching in my throat as the sum grew larger and larger. By the time I reached the receipts from 3 years ago, the total on my screen read $35,400. $35,000 spent on groceries and supplies that were completely unaccounted for inside our home. Our own refrigerator was often half empty because Chloe preferred ordering expensive takeout or eating at upscale vegan restaurants downtown. I did my own modest grocery shopping separately. The food on these receipts was never stored in my kitchen. The shaving cream was never in our bathrooms. The men's socks were never in our laundry. I slumped into Chloe's ergonomic desk chair, the receipts scattered around me like autumn leaves. Someone else was consuming these things. A man. A man who wore size large socks, who needed to shave his face, who needed protein to maintain whatever muscle mass he had left. And the vitamin D. My medical training kicked in, cold and analytical. You give high-dose vitamin D to patients who are suffering from severe deficiencies. You give it to people who never see the sun, people who are kept in the dark, like someone locked beneath a concrete floor. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I wanted to scream, to tear the room apart, but a terrifying clarity suddenly took hold. If I confronted Chloe now, with nothing but receipts, she would spin another flawless lie. I needed to see her face when I asked. I needed to look into my daughter's eyes and find the crack in her armor. I gathered the receipts, organizing them exactly as I'd found them, and placed the accordion folder back into the filing cabinet. By the time I heard the crunch of her tires on the gravel driveway at 6:15, The office was pristine, and a pot roast was simmering in the oven, filling the house with the deceptive scent of a normal, happy home. Chloe walked through the front door glowing with success. She had shed her trench coat, her sleek blazer looking sharp and professional. "Mom, it smells amazing in here," she called out, dropping her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. "The meeting went perfectly. They want to commission 3 massive terrariums for their new corporate lobby." "That's wonderful news, sweetheart," I said, forcing a warm smile as I set the dining table. "You've been working so hard. Come, sit down. Dinner is ready." We sat across from each other. The dining room was dimly lit by the chandelier, casting long shadows against the walls. Chloe poured herself a glass of red wine, chatting animatedly about plant specificities and profit margins. And she looked so relaxed, so innocent. It was almost impossible to reconcile the woman sitting in front of me with the terrifying calculations I had made hours earlier. I waited until she was halfway through her meal, until her guard was completely down, before I made my move. "You know, Chloe," I began, keeping my voice light and conversational, pouring myself a glass of water. "I was going through the mail today, organizing some of my old bank statements, and it got me thinking about our household budget. With inflation lately, everything is so expensive. Have you noticed your grocery expenses going up?" Chloe paused, her fork hovering over her plate. "A little, I suppose. Everything is getting pricier. It's just that I was looking for a misplaced receipt for my heart medication," I lied smoothly, holding her gaze, "and that I accidentally saw one of your Costco receipts on the counter the other day. It looked quite large. I figured you must be hosting client dinners or perhaps stockpiling for the business." There was a brief silence. It lasted no more than 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, I saw the microscopic tightening of her jaw, the slight shift in her posture. Then the flawless mask slipped right back into place. "Oh, that," Chloe said, letting out a soft, compassionate sigh. She set her fork down and offered me a gentle smile. "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, Mom, because you know I don't like bragging about this sort of thing. But I've been doing a lot of work with the Portland Haven shelter downtown." "A shelter?" I asked, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "Yes. The homeless crisis in the city has gotten so bad. Hey, there are so many men out there on the streets, especially veterans, who don't even have basic necessities. So, every few weeks I buy in bulk. Protein powder to help them keep their strength up, warm socks, shaving cream so they can clean up for job interviews. I just drop the boxes off anonymously. It's my way of giving back, considering how successful the business has been." Her voice was smooth, confident, and utterly convincing. It was the perfect philanthropic excuse for a wealthy, successful woman. Anyone else would have believed her. Anyone else would have praised her generosity. But I was not anyone else. I was her mother. I had spent 40 years reading the subtle signs of pain and deception in patients who wanted to hide their suffering. I saw the way her knuckles had gone completely white around the stem of her wine glass. I saw the tiny pulsing vein at her temple. "That is incredibly thoughtful of you, Chloe," I said quietly. "You have such a kind heart." She relaxed visibly, taking a long sip of her wine. "I try, Mom. I really do." We finished the rest of the dinner in polite conversation about the weather and her upcoming projects. It was all so agonizingly normal. But beneath the table, my hands were curled into tight fists. Her lie was brilliant, was still a lie. The Portland Haven shelter had closed down its men's donation center over a year ago due to funding cuts. I knew this because my church had to redirect our own annual charity drives. Chloe was lying to my face, drinking wine and eating the dinner I cooked, while the man who wore those large socks and took those vitamin D pills sat in the dark beneath the greenhouse. The receipts were just the beginning. I knew what I had to do next. I had to find the money. Friday morning arrived with the same unrelenting gray drizzle that had washed over Portland for days, casting a pale, sickly light through the large kitchen windows. I stood at the sink, mechanically scrubbing a skillet from last night's dinner, my mind locked in a relentless, exhausting loop. The receipts, the shaving cream, the vitamin D, the flawless, sickeningly perfect lie Chloe had told me over a glass of red wine. And beneath it all, the phantom vibration of a cello string echoing from the cold earth beneath the greenhouse. I had barely slept, my nursing instincts keeping my adrenaline spiking every time the old house settled or the wind rattled the window panes. At exactly 9:15, my cell phone vibrated on the granite counter. The caller ID flashed the name Robert Vance. Robert was a senior partner at a prestigious wealth management firm downtown and had been David's closest friend since their college days. He had handled our family's finances for over 3 decades, guiding us through David's passing and the subsequent establishment of the estate. He rarely called me directly, unless it was time for my annual portfolio review in December. I dried my hands on a dish towel and answered. "Good morning, Robert. Is everything all right?" "Evelyn." His voice was tight, strained, lacking his usual warm, booming cadence. He sounded out of breath, as if he had been pacing his office. "I need you to come down to my office. Right now. Today. Can you make the drive?" My grip tightened on the phone. "Robert, what's wrong?" "You sound terrible." "It's about the trust fund," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The one David set up for Lucas. There is something I need to show you in person, Evelyn. I can't discuss it over the phone. Please, how soon can you get here?" "Give me 40 minutes, I said, my heart instantly kicking into a frantic, irregular rhythm. I left the skillet in the sink, grabbed my raincoat, and drove toward the city center. The traffic on I-405 was sluggish, the rain turning the highway into a blur of red taillights and gray exhaust, giving me far too much time to think. When David died, he had left a substantial life insurance policy and a portion of his business shares specifically earmarked for Lucas. It was a trust fund totaling $650,000, designed to be handed over when Lucas turned 25. When Lucas vanished 9 years ago at the age of 21, the money sat untouched. A year after his disappearance, in a haze of grief and depression, I had signed the paperwork making Chloe the temporary trustee. She was brilliant with numbers, responsible, and she had convinced me it was the best way to protect her brother's assets, just in case he came back to us. I had trusted her completely. Robert Vance's office was situated on the 14th floor of a sleek glass high-rise in the Pearl District. Usually his assistant greeted me with an espresso and a warm smile, but today Robert was waiting for me at the elevator banks himself. He looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen him. The deep lines around his mouth were pronounced, and his eyes carried a heavy, sorrowful weight. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he murmured, ushering me past the reception desk and straight into his corner office. He shut the heavy mahogany door until the latch clicked, then walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pulled the blinds shut, cutting off the view of the gloomy Portland skyline. "Sit down, Evelyn," he said gently, gesturing to one of the leather armchairs opposite his desk. I sat, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. Robert took a deep breath, walked behind his desk, and opened a thick manila folder. He spread a series of dense spreadsheets, bank statements, and wire transfer logs across the polished wood surface. The pages were heavily annotated with red ink. "As a fiduciary, my first obligation is to protect my client's assets," Robert began, his voice heavy with regret. "I am so sorry, Evelyn. I should have caught this earlier, but the transfers were staggered, disguised beneath layers of corporate LLCs and shell vendors tied to Chloe's terrarium business. I only flagged the pattern during a deep forensic audit I initiated 2 days ago for the upcoming fiscal quarter." "Caught what, Robert?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What pattern?" He turned a spreadsheet around so I could read it. David left Lucas $650,000. Legally, Chloe was supposed to safeguard that money as the temporary trustee, only allowing withdrawals for emergency maintenance of the principal. But that is not what happened. He placed a heavy finger on a column of numbers highlighted in aggressive red marker. Over the past 9 years, Chloe has systematically drained the account. It started small, just months after Lucas went missing. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, labeled as investigative fees or legal retainers for private detectives looking for him. But then the numbers escalated. She funneled money into her own business accounts, labeling them as high-yield short-term loans that she never paid back. Evelyn, the trust fund is almost entirely gone. I stared at the numbers, my vision blurring. How much, Robert? Tell me. $480,000, Robert said quietly. She has withdrawn $480,000 of her missing brother's money. The air was sucked out of the room. Nearly $500,000. While I had been weeping in my bedroom, handing out flyers on street corners, and praying for my boy to come home, my daughter had been systematically bleeding his legacy dry. But as horrifying as the theft was, the numbers didn't explain the razor blades. They didn't explain the medical antiseptic. Where did the bulk of it go? I demanded, my tone shifting from devastated to clinical, the ER nurse in me taking over. Show me the largest expenditures. What did she buy? Robert looked at me, clearly surprised by my sudden composure. He shuffled the papers and pulled out a single, stark invoice backed by a bank wire confirmation. This is what triggered the audit, Robert explained, sliding the paper toward me. 8.5 years ago, a single wire transfer was made for $120,000 in cash, and it was paid to a company called Cascade Excavation, an independent contractor operating out of rural Idaho. It was paid in full up front. I picked up the invoice. My eyes locked onto the description of services rendered. The words seemed to burn themselves into my retinas. Project: construction of subterranean storm shelter and reinforced deep drainage system. Site location: Portland, Oregon. Scope: 20 by 15-foot concrete enclosure, sound dampening insulation, independent ventilation, heavy-duty steel access hatch. A storm shelter, I whispered, the paper shaking violently in my hands. Yes, Robert said, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. It made absolutely no sense. I checked the property tax records this morning, Evelyn. There are no permits on file for your address. Oregon law requires massive amounts of municipal permitting, a geological surveying, and safety inspections to build a subterranean bunker. If someone built a shelter on your property, they did it completely off the books. They hired an out-of-state crew to avoid local oversight, and they paid them a fortune in stolen cash to keep their mouths shut. A 20 by 15-foot concrete enclosure, sound dampening insulation, independent ventilation. My mind raced back to the greenhouse. I remembered the dimensions. The exterior of the structure was 40 by 30 feet, but the interior workspace always felt oddly constrained, cut short by the massive platform holding the irrigation tanks and the giant monstera plants. I remembered Marcus the plumber explaining that the water pump was vibrating against the concrete foundation. I remembered the heavy scent of isopropyl alcohol, the high-dose vitamin D, corked, and the rhythmic, mournful tapping of a cello string echoing through the floor grates. Chloe didn't just steal Lucas's money. She had used his own inheritance to pay an out-of-state contractor to dig a hole in the earth. She had used his money to build a soundproof concrete prison directly beneath my prize-winning orchids. Evelyn? Robert asked, leaning forward, alarmed by the sudden, terrifying blankness on my face. Evelyn, are you okay? Should I call the police regarding the fraud? I stood up slowly, carefully setting the invoice back down on the mahogany desk. My grief had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical, and absolute fury. The cognitive dissonance of the past 24 hours was gone. The puzzle pieces had violently snapped together, forming a picture so depraved it defied human comprehension. Shake, but I understood it now. No, Robert, do not call the police, I said, my voice eerily calm, steady as a surgeon's scalpel. Not yet. If you spook her, she might destroy the evidence. Or worse, give me copies of everything you have here, every single page. What are you going to do? Robert asked, his hands trembling as he moved to the photocopier. I'm going to check the foundation of my greenhouse, I replied, staring blankly at the gray rain lashing against the high-rise window. And then I'm going to bring my son back from the dead. The drive back to the estate from Robert's downtown office was a blur of gray rain and agonizing clarity. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers seemed to mimic the tapping I had heard beneath the greenhouse floor, a relentless metronome counting down the seconds of a 9-year lie. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white, my mind operating with the cold, detached precision I had honed over 40 years in emergency rooms. In the ER, when a trauma patient is wheeled in, you do not panic, you do not cry, you assess the damage, you gather your instruments, and you stop the bleeding. My family was the trauma patient. My daughter was the hemorrhage, and I was gathering my instruments. I pulled into the driveway just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The house was exactly as I had left it, silent and imposing against the backdrop of the towering Douglas firs. I unlocked the front door, shedding my damp coat, and walked straight into the kitchen. I needed to sit down, to organize the copies of the financial records Robert had given me, or to formulate a plan that would not alert Chloe before I was ready to strike. But before I could even spread the papers across the kitchen island, a sharp, hesitant knock rattled the front door. I froze. Chloe was not due back from her meetings for another 2 hours, and she had a key. I walked slowly down the hallway and peered through the peephole. Standing on the porch, huddled beneath a dripping yellow umbrella, was Margaret Higgins. Margaret was 68 years old, a retired librarian who lived in the Victorian house directly adjacent to the back edge of my property. She was a quiet, solitary woman who had been widowed around the same time I had lost David. We were friendly, but not close, sharing occasional pleasantries over the property line. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Margaret looked terrified. Her face was pale, her silver hair plastered to her cheeks by the wind, and her hands were trembling violently as she clutched a heavy canvas tote bag against her chest. Margaret, please, come in out of the rain, I said, stepping aside to let her into the foyer. She stepped over the threshold, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway, as if she expected Chloe to emerge from the shadows. Evelyn, I am so sorry to intrude. I know I shouldn't be here, but I didn't know what else to do. I've been sitting in my living room all morning, sick to my stomach. Come into the sitting room. I guided her gently, my nurse's intuition sensing her profound distress. I led her to the sofa and sat beside her. Margaret, take a deep breath. What is going on? She set the wet umbrella on the floor and placed the canvas tote bag on her lap. Her hands shook so badly she could barely undo the top button of her coat. You know I suffer from terrible insomnia, Evelyn. Ever since Arthur passed, I cannot sleep past 2 a.m. To pass the time, I took up night bird watching. I have a high-powered spotting scope set up in my second-floor bedroom window. It looks directly out over the tree line and straight down onto the back alley behind your greenhouse. My pulse hammered in my ears. I sat perfectly still, my voice deadly calm. What did you see, Margaret? Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. I should have come to you years ago. I am so ashamed of my silence, Evelyn. I truly am. But at first, I thought I was just a nosy old woman misunderstanding things. Then, I was simply too afraid. But after I saw Marcus the plumber leaving your house this morning, looking like he had seen a ghost. I realized I couldn't carry this burden anymore. She reached into the canvas bag and pulled out 3 thick, leather-bound notebooks. The spines were worn and cracked from years of use. She handed the top one to me. "I started keeping a record," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. "9 years ago, right after your boy, Lucas, went missing. I noticed movement in your backyard in the dead of night. It was Chloe." I opened the notebook. The pages were filled with Margaret's meticulous, looping handwriting, organized by date and exact timestamps, displaying the obsessive precision of a dedicated bird watcher. October 14th, 2017, 3:15 a.m. Chloe exited the back door of the main house, carrying a large, heavy catering tray covered with aluminum foil, entered the greenhouse. Lights remained off. Exited at 3:45 a.m. Tray empty. March 22nd, 2019, 3:10 a.m. Chloe, carrying 2 heavy plastic grocery bags, looked over her shoulder toward the street before unlocking the greenhouse door. Inside for 40 minutes. July 8th, 2021, 3:15 a.m. Chloe, carrying a cardboard box. Logo on the side indicates bulk medical supplies. Looked like IV, saline bags, and heavy rolls of gauze. Rain was heavy, but she did not use an umbrella. I flipped through page after page, book after book. Hundreds of entries. 9 years of grueling, undeniable documentation. Every single entry occurred between 3 and 4 in the morning, always when the rest of the neighborhood was deeply asleep. The items she carried, the bulk food, and the medical supplies, aligned with terrifying perfection with the Costco and Target receipts I had found in her office, the isolation, the routine. It was the clinical schedule of a warden feeding a prisoner. "She has been going out there almost every single night for 9 years. Margaret sobbed quietly into a tissue. "Always so careful, always making sure your bedroom light was off." "Margaret," I said, my voice barely recognizable to my own ears, thick with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and absolute horror. "You have no idea what this means to me." "Thank you." "There is more, Evelyn," she said, sniffing loudly. She reached into the bottom of the canvas tote and pulled out a small silver USB drive. She set it on the coffee table between us as if it were a live explosive. 3 years ago, my son installed high-definition, motion-activated security cameras on my roofline because of some car break-ins on our street, Margaret explained. "One of the cameras points directly at the back alley access behind your greenhouse. The alley you and David stopped using years ago. I brought the footage. I needed to know I wasn't losing my mind." I didn't hesitate. I stood up, walked to the oak desk in the corner of the room, and grabbed my laptop. I brought it back to the coffee table, flipped it open, and plugged the silver USB drive into the port. A folder popped up on the screen, containing dozens of video files, all dated and time-stamped. I clicked on a file from 4 months ago. The screen flickered to life in crisp, black and white night vision. The camera angle looked down onto the narrow, overgrown alleyway behind the glass walls of Chloe's studio. Felt the timestamp read 2:14 a.m. For a few seconds, the alley was empty. Then, the sleek, dark shape of a vehicle crept into the frame. It was a black SUV, driving at a crawl with its headlights completely turned off, navigating by the ambient moonlight. It pulled up directly behind the rear access door of the greenhouse and parked. The driver's side door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the night. Even in the grainy night vision, I recognized his profile, his posture, and the distinct way he carried himself. It was Julian, Chloe's ex-boyfriend, the man who had supposedly broken her heart and moved to Seattle 5 years ago to work in tech. My breath caught in my throat. Julian walked to the back of the SUV, popped the trunk, and hauled out 2 massive white styrofoam coolers, the kind of heavy-duty, insulated boxes used for transporting bulk perishables, or, as my nursing mind instantly supplied medical-grade cold storage. As Julian carried the coolers toward the greenhouse, the rear door opened from the inside. Chloe stepped into the frame. She was wearing a dark hoodie, her face pale in the infrared light. She didn't greet him with a hug or a kiss. There was no romance in this interaction. It was purely transactional. They exchanged a few hurried, tense whispers that the camera's microphone couldn't pick up. Julian handed over the heavy coolers, his body language rigid and anxious. Chloe nodded, pulled the boxes inside the dark greenhouse, and shut the heavy door. Julian immediately returned to his SUV and drove away, slipping back into the shadows of the alley. I clicked another file. 3 weeks later, same time. Same black SUV without headlights. Julian delivering heavy, unmarked boxes to my daughter in the dead of night. "He comes every 3 or 4 weeks," Margaret whispered, watching the screen over my shoulder. "Like clockwork. He brings the supplies that are too heavy or too suspicious for her to buy herself." The room spun. The conspiracy was widening, the roots of the betrayal digging deeper into the earth than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just Chloe. Julian was part of it. Julian, who used to sit at our dining room table and laugh at David's jokes. Julian, who had helped search the woods for Lucas when the police dogs lost his scent. I closed the laptop, the sharp snap of the casing echoing in the quiet room. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were assembled into a horrifying, flawless mosaic in the $120,000 subterranean bunker. The fraudulent trust fund withdrawals, the receipts for razors and vitamin D, the cello vibrating beneath the concrete. And now, 9 years of handwritten surveillance logs and high-definition video of midnight smuggling runs involving an ex-boyfriend. "Evelyn," Margaret said, her hand reaching out to squeeze my arm. "What is in that greenhouse? What has she done?" I looked at the older woman, my eyes burning with a cold, unrelenting fire. I carefully gathered the 3 leather notebooks and the silver USB drive, pressing them against my chest as if they were oxygen. "She has made a terrible mistake, Margaret," I said softly, staring out the window toward the glass structure looming in the rain. "And tonight, I'm going to correct it. The text message arrived on Saturday morning, just as I was carefully hiding Margaret's leather notebooks and the USB drive in a locked fireproof box beneath my floorboards. The name on the screen made my breath hitch. Maya. Maya had been Lucas's closest friend since middle school. She was a fiery, fiercely loyal girl who used to sit on our living room floor for hours, listening to Lucas practice his cello. When he vanished 9 years ago, she had been the one to print the first batch of missing person flyers. She had called me every Sunday for the first 2 years, her voice slowly losing its hopeful cadence until eventually the call stopped altogether. I hadn't seen or spoken to her in almost 6 years. The message was brief, completely devoid of the warmth I remembered. "Mrs. Evelyn, I need to see you. And I found something. Please meet me at the Stumptown Coffee on Belmont at noon today. It's about Lucas." I didn't reply. I simply grabbed my coat and my car keys. The coffee shop was bustling with the usual weekend Portland crowd, people in vintage flannel typing on laptops, the hiss of the espresso machine cutting through the indie folk music playing overhead. I arrived 15 minutes early and secured a booth in the far back corner, away from the large storefront windows. At precisely noon, the bell above the door chimed, and Maya walked in. She was 30 years old now, her youthful features sharpened by time and, from the look in her eyes, a profound exhaustion. She was struggling to carry 2 large, heavy cardboard boxes, her knuckles white from the strain. I immediately stood up and moved to help her, taking one of the boxes and resting it gently on the wooden table between us. "Maya," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "it's been so long. Let me look at you." She didn't offer a hug. Her eyes, dark and incredibly intense, locked onto mine. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Evelyn. I know it's been years, and I'm sorry for dropping off the grid, but I didn't know how to keep looking at you when we both knew he was gone. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. Except, I don't think he is gone, and I think Chloe knows exactly where he is. The name struck the air between us like a physical blow. I felt the familiar, icy calm of the emergency room descend over me. What did you find, Maya? Without a word, Maya opened the flaps of the first cardboard box. She reached inside, carefully pulling back layers of protective bubble wrap, and lifted out a massive, breathtakingly beautiful glass terrarium. It was one of Chloe's signature pieces, a large geometric glass dome housing a meticulously crafted miniature ecosystem. It was lush with vibrant green star moss, tiny creeping ferns, and delicate pieces of polished slate. But what made Chloe's high-end pieces truly famous, the ones that sold for $1,500, a pop to corporate executives and wealthy collectors, were the architectural centerpieces. Inside this specific dome sat a stunning microscopic wooden bridge arching over a bed of blue crushed glass, leading to a tiny, perfectly proportioned clay house. Maya opened the second box and pulled out another terrarium, this one featuring a miniature wooden observation tower spiraling up a piece of driftwood. From her tote bag, she carefully extracted a third, a smaller glass globe containing a tiny carved wooden gazebo surrounded by miniature bonsai. Chloe's prestige collection, I noted, my voice clinically detached despite the hammering in my chest. I know these. They take weeks to assemble. She claims they are inspired by her travels. They aren't inspired by her travels, Maya said, her voice shaking with the mixture of rage and grief. Mrs. Evelyn, do you remember what Lucas used to do when his fingers bled from practicing the cello too long? When he needed a break but couldn't keep his hands still? The memory surfaced instantly, vivid and heartbreaking. He whittled, I whispered. He used to carve tiny pieces of balsa wood and mold modeling clay. He made little houses, little bridges. And he used to leave them on the kitchen windowsill. Exactly, Maya said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a heavy jeweler's magnifying glass. I work as an appraiser for an auction house downtown now. 2 weeks ago, a client brought in one of Chloe's early custom terrariums to be valued as part of an estate sale. I was examining the miniature wooden watermill inside to assess the craftsmanship. I noticed a mark, a tiny, deliberate scratch on the underside of the wood. She pushed the first terrarium, the one with the wooden bridge, to the center of the table. She positioned the magnifying glass perfectly against the curved glass dome, aligning it with the shadowed underside of the miniature clay house's wooden porch. Look, she commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Look right where the main pillar meets the base. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my joints ached. I pressed my eye to the magnifying glass. At first, all I saw was the magnified texture of the stained wood, the tiny grooves of the grain. But then, as the light caught the surface just right, I saw it. Carved into the wood with what must have been the tip of a microscopic needle was a symbol. It was flawless in its execution, despite being no larger than a grain of rice. It was the letter L, elegantly sweeping upward, its lower tail seamlessly wrapping and curling into the distinct, undeniable shape of a bass clef. A gasp tore from my throat. I pulled back from the glass, my hand flying to my mouth. He used to carve that onto the bottom of everything he made, Maya said, tears finally spilling over her lashes. It was his secret signature. L for Lucas, bound forever to the music he loved. I asked him once why he hid it where no one could see it. He told me, if someone cares enough to look closely, they'll find me. My vision blurred. The coffee shop, the indie music, the smell of roasted beans, all faded into a roaring static. My son had left his mark. He was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs in the only medium he had left. I couldn't believe it, Maya continued, frantically wiping her eyes. I thought maybe Chloe had found his old carvings and used them, so I started tracking down her sales. I used my auction house credentials to access private buyer registries. I tracked down 18 of these specific, custom-built terrariums sold over the last 4 years. 18, Mrs. Her Evelyn! She pushed the second terrarium forward, then the third, tapping the glass of each one. I visited the collectors. I made up excuses about cataloging regional art. I looked at every single one of them with my loupe. All 18 pieces have the exact same hidden signature, the bass clef intertwined with the L. Some are carved into the tiny wooden steps. Some are etched into the fired clay of the miniature roofs. Mrs. Evelyn, Lucas didn't make 18 intricate miniature houses before he disappeared. He's making them now. The sheer scale of the horror settled over me like a suffocating lead blanket. The pieces I had gathered over the past 48 hours suddenly locked into a terrifying, flawless mechanism. The subterranean bunker built for $120,000, and the heavy deliveries of medical supplies and bulk food in the dead of night. The warm coffee mug in the greenhouse, the faint, mournful vibration of the cello strings beneath the concrete. And now, this. Chloe hadn't just imprisoned her brother. She had weaponized his captivity. She had monetized his sanity. She was forcing him to sit in a dark concrete box beneath the earth, utilizing his delicate hands to carve the exquisite, microscopic centerpieces that fueled her luxury empire. She was selling his silent screams for $1,500 apiece to corporate executives who had no idea they were displaying the desperate cries of a captive man on their boardroom tables. "He's alive," I breathed, the words tasting like ash and iron in my mouth. "Maya, he's alive. And he's been right under my feet this entire time." Maya reached across the table, her hands grasping mine with desperate bruising force. "She is using him, Mrs. Evelyn. She locked him away and turned him into a ghost so she could steal his talent. We have to call the police. We have to kick down that greenhouse door today." "No," I said, the ER nurse returning, cold, analytical, and ruthlessly focused. I squeezed her hands back, my eyes locking onto hers with a ferocity that made her flinch. "If we call the police without knowing exactly how that bunker operates, Chloe will know. She has had 9 years to prepare for discovery. If she has a fail-safe, if she decides to flood that room, or vent carbon monoxide into it before the police can breach the steel door, Lucas dies." Maya stared at me, and the blood draining from her face as she processed the logistical nightmare of the trap our Lucas was in. "Then what do we do?" I looked down at the tiny, perfect wooden bridge inside the glass dome. I thought of my boy, sitting in the dark, carving his name into the wood, hoping against hope that his mother would care enough to look closely. "We gather the rest of the poison," I said, my voice as hard and unforgiving as the concrete beneath my greenhouse. "And then, Maya, we amputate." Night descended over the Portland estate like a heavy, suffocating shroud. I sat in the wingback chair in the corner of my darkened bedroom, listening to the relentless rhythm of the rain lashing against the window panes. My bags were packed, not with clothes, but with the evidence: Robert's financial audits, Margaret's leather notebooks, and the silver USB drive, and the tiny wooden bridge bearing Lucas's hidden signature. The house was entirely silent, save for the hum of the central heating and the settling of old timber. I waited until exactly 1 a.m. Chloe's bedroom was located at the opposite end of the second floor, a master suite that overlooked the front driveway. She was a notoriously heavy sleeper, a trait she used to joke was the key to her flawless complexion. But I took no chances. I waited until the sliver of light beneath her door was extinguished, and then I waited another full hour. When the digital clock on my nightstand shifted to 1:15, I finally moved. I was dressed in dark slacks, a heavy waterproof jacket, and rubber-soled nursing shoes that made absolutely no sound against the hardwood floors. In my deep pockets, I carried a heavy-duty industrial tape measure, a high-beam LED flashlight, and my cell phone. The walk down the grand staircase felt like navigating a minefield. Every creak of the floorboard sent a spike of adrenaline straight into my heart. But 40 years in emergency medicine had taught me how to compartmentalize terror. You do not let your hands shake when you are holding a scalpel, and you do not panic when you are walking toward a trauma. I reached the kitchen, slipped out the back door, and stepped into the freezing Oregon downpour. The greenhouse loomed in the darkness, a massive silhouette of glass and steel. I unlocked the side door with my master key, easing it open and slipping inside. The air was instantly oppressive, thick with humidity, the smell of damp potting soil, and that faint, an undeniable undertone of medical-grade antiseptic. The automated grow lights were off, leaving the space bathed in the eerie, fragmented glow of the security lamps from the alleyway. I pulled out my flashlight, keeping the beam angled low toward the floor to avoid casting visible beams through the glass ceiling. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart, and pulled out the heavy industrial tape measure. It was time to map the anatomy of my daughter's lies. I started on the outside, stepping back into the rain to measure the exterior foundation walls. I hooked the metal tab onto the rear corner and walked the length of the structure, 40 feet long. I measured the width, 30 feet wide. The greenhouse occupied exactly 1,200 square feet of the backyard. I went back inside, shaking the cold rain from my jacket, and began measuring the interior usable space. I started at the front doors and paced out the primary work area, running the bright yellow tape along the baseboards. The main floor, where Chloe kept her workbenches, display shelves, and the smaller terrariums, was wide and expansive, but as I moved toward the back of the greenhouse, the architecture abruptly changed. The entire rear section of the structure was dominated by a raised concrete dais, elevated about 3 feet off the main floor. Chloe had always claimed this massive solid block was the reinforced foundation necessary to support her 2,000-gallon hydroponic irrigation tanks and the dense root systems of her largest exotic plants. It stretched across the entire width of the room. I ran the tape measure from the edge of this raised concrete platform to the back wall of the greenhouse, 20 feet. I measured the width of the solid structure, 15 feet, 20 by 15 feet. I stared at the glowing yellow numbers on the tape measure, the chill in my bones deepening until I felt like I was made of ice. The math was undeniable. The interior usable space was drastically truncated by this massive elevated block. Exactly 300 square feet of the greenhouse was unaccounted for. A 20 by 15-foot concrete enclosure, sound dampening insulation. Robert's invoice from the Idaho Excavation Company echoed in my mind with terrifying clarity. The bunker wasn't just beneath the greenhouse. It was built into it, concealed within the raised concrete foundation itself. Before I climbed the 3 concrete steps onto the elevated dais, the space was crowded with heavy filtration machinery, thick PVC pipes, and 3 massive custom-built wooden planter boxes. The largest box sat dead center. It was easily 8 feet wide and 4 feet tall, constructed from thick, dark mahogany. Inside it grew a gargantuan monstera plant, its massive split leaves reaching toward the glass ceiling like grasping green hands. I approached the mahogany planter. It looked incredibly heavy, filled with cubic yards of dense, wet soil. I aimed my flashlight at the base, sweeping the beam along the floor where the wood met the concrete. My breath hitched. The planter box was not resting directly on the concrete. There was a microscopic gap, perhaps a quarter of an inch. I dropped to my knees, pressing my face close to the floor, and shined the light into the narrow crevice. Embedded flawlessly flush with the concrete surface were heavy-duty stainless steel industrial tracks. The entire massive planter, weighing perhaps thousands of pounds, was sitting on a motorized rail system. I scrambled up, running my hands along the dark mahogany wood, searching for a seam, a hinge, a button. My fingers traced the decorative molding along the side facing the back wall, hidden from view from the main floor. The wood felt smooth, seamless, but as I reached the bottom corner, my fingertips brushed against a small rectangular indentation. I aimed the flashlight directly at it. It was a biometric digital keypad, recessed into the wood and painted the exact dark brown shade of the mahogany. A tiny LCD screen was completely dark, awaiting input. My hands began to tremble. I stared at the keypad. What combination would Chloe use? I thought of the psychological profile of a woman who could lock her own brother in the dark to steal his art. She was arrogant. She was sentimental in a deeply twisted way. I thought about the year Lucas vanished, the year she had cemented her control over his life, his money, and his talent. I reached out and typed the 4 digits on the touchscreen, 2017. The keypad beeped softly, a sound barely louder than a raindrop hitting glass. The tiny LCD screen flashed a brilliant neon green. A low, guttural mechanical hum vibrated through the soles of my shoes. Deep within the concrete, high-torque industrial motors engaged. Slowly, with terrifying smoothness, the massive mahogany planter box began to glide backward along the hidden tracks, and the giant monstera leaves rustled violently as the structure moved, sliding exactly 4 feet to the left before locking into its new position with a heavy metallic thud. Where the planter had been sitting just seconds before, the concrete floor was gone. In its place was a heavy industrial steel hatch, set completely flush with the floor. It was painted a dull, matte gray, devoid of any handles, completely flat. In the center of the steel square was a recessed electronic deadbolt, currently glowing with a small, unlocked green indicator light, triggered by the planter's movement. I stood at the edge of the abyss, my lungs burning as I forgot how to breathe. There it was, the $120,000 secret, the tomb my daughter had built with my son's inheritance. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the agonizing pain in my joints, and pressed my ear flat against the freezing, damp steel of the hatch. I closed my eyes, blocking out the greenhouse, the rain, the entire world above ground. For 10 seconds, there was only the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. And then I heard it. It was a wet, ragged cough, muffled by the heavy steel and the layers of sound-dampening insulation, but undeniably human. The cough was followed by a sharp, desperate intake of breath, and then a low, broken sob that cracked the remaining fragments of my heart into dust. "Lucas," I mouthed, the word tearing at my vocal cords, though I made no sound. Every single maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to claw at the steel. I wanted to smash the electronic deadbolt, to throw open the heavy hatch, to plunge into the darkness and drag my starving, brilliant boy back into the light. My fingers curled into claws against the cold metal. I wanted to scream his name until my lungs gave out. But as I reached for the recessed latch, the emergency room nurse violently seized control of the mother. "Stop," the clinical voice in my head commanded. "Assess the trauma." I froze, my hand hovering an inch above the steel. If I opened that hatch right now, an alarm would undoubtedly trigger in Chloe's bedroom. She would wake up. She would come downstairs. I was a 62-year-old woman. She was 35, strong, and completely unhinged. If she caught me here, she could lock us both down there. Or worse, she could activate a failsafe, a ventilation shutoff, a chemical release. The contractor had built this bunker to her exact, paranoid specifications. I could not risk Lucas's life on a moment of emotional desperation. I had to secure the perimeter. I had to bring overwhelming force. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast, dripping onto the cold steel hatch. I pressed my palm flat against the metal, sending all the love, all the desperate apologies I possessed down into the dark. I am here, my beautiful boy, I thought fiercely. Hold on, just a little longer. Mom is here. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt like lead, but I backed away from the hatch. I did not touch the keypad to close the planter. I wanted the entrance exposed, undeniable. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. My thumb shook violently as I unlocked the screen and tapped the emergency dialer. I didn't call Robert. I didn't call Maya. I dialed 911. The operator answered on the first ring. 911. What is your emergency? I looked down at the steel hatch, the rain pounding against the glass roof above me, and spoke with a voice that was cold, absolute, and utterly devoid of mercy. My name is Evelyn Vance, I said, staring into the dark. Send units to 4420 Blackwood Drive immediately. Bring medical personnel. My daughter has been keeping a man locked in a concrete bunker beneath my property for 9 years, and I am looking right at the door. I lowered my phone, the 911 dispatcher's promise of immediate assistance still ringing in my ears. The heavy steel hatch remained exposed in the dim light of the greenhouse, a silent testament to the nightmare buried beneath the concrete. I turned to head back to the main house to unlock the front door for the authorities, but before my hand even touched the glass door, a pair of headlights slashed through the heavy, relentless Oregon rain. A black SUV, the exact same vehicle I had watched on Margaret's night vision security footage, skidded violently onto the gravel of the back alley. It came to a harsh, sliding halt just feet from the greenhouse's exterior wall. The driver's door flew open, and Julian stumbled out into the freezing downpour. He wasn't the composed, secretive smuggler I had seen on the screen. He was a trembling, hollow-eyed ghost of a man, his clothes instantly plastered to his skin by the storm. He saw me standing in the doorway of the greenhouse, illuminated by the pale security light, and he froze. His eyes darted to the heavy industrial tape measure still gripped in my hand, and then past me, locking onto the gaping, dark hole where the massive mahogany planter used to sit. He dropped to his knees right there in the mud. "You found it," he choked out, his voice cracking over the sound of the rain. "Oh, God, you found it." I stepped out of the greenhouse, letting the cold rain wash over me. I felt no chill. I felt nothing but a searing, white-hot rage that had burned away every ounce of my grief. "The police are on their way, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the storm like shattered glass. "You have exactly 5 minutes before this estate is swarming with sirens. Give me one single reason why I shouldn't tell them you built that tomb." He scrambled forward, his hands sinking deep into the wet gravel as if pleading for his life. "I didn't build it. I swear to you, Mrs. Evelyn, I didn't build the bunker. Chloe did. But I helped put him in there." He covered his face, his broad shoulders heaving with violent, pathetic sobs. "I couldn't take it anymore. She called me an hour ago, frantic, saying you were asking questions about the grocery bills. She told me to come and clear the supplies out of the bunker tonight. But I can't. I can't do this anymore." "Get up," I commanded, stepping back so he wouldn't touch my shoes. "Get inside the kitchen. Now, before the neighbors wake up." He stumbled to his feet and followed me into the house like a beaten dog. He stood dripping on the linoleum floor of my kitchen, a shivering, hyperventilating mess. I stood across from him, arms crossed, my expression carved from stone. I channeled 40 years of emergency room discipline, staring him down with the clinical detachment of a nurse assessing a fatal wound. "Talk," I ordered, "and if you lie to me, Julian, I will make sure you never see the sky again. Why is my son in a concrete box?" Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting wildly around the kitchen as if searching for a way out that didn't exist. "It was 9 years ago," he began, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "I was in trouble. Deep, dangerous trouble. I owed $60,000 to some very bad people. It was cryptocurrency debt. The market crashed overnight, and my leveraged margins were called in. They threatened to kill me, Mrs. Evelyn. I was desperate." I stared at him, feeling my stomach twist with disgust. And Chloe knew. "She knew," Julian confirmed, wiping rain and tears from his face. "I begged her for a loan. She said she didn't have that kind of cash liquid. But she said she had a plan. She knew Lucas was coming into his trust fund soon, and if she had control of it, she could pay off my debt. But she needed a reason to get control. She needed Lucas out of the picture, and she needed him too terrified to ever contact the police or a lawyer. "What did you do to my boy?" I demanded, stepping closer, closing the distance until I could see the dilated, terrified pupils of his eyes. "We staged it," he wept, his hands shaking in front of his chest. "It was the night of that terrible November storm. Chloe sent Lucas a frantic text from a burner phone, pretending to be a mutual friend stranded up near the winding roads of the Columbia River Gorge. She knew he would go. He was always so gentle, so eager to help anyone in trouble. I drove up there an hour before him in a stolen truck. It was pitch black, raining sideways. Visibility was zero. Julian's breathing turned ragged as the memory overtook him. I set up a bicycle on the edge of a sharp, blind hairpin turn. Beside it, I laid out a medical mannequin, dressed in professional cycling gear. I poured 2 gallons of fake theatrical blood all over the asphalt. When Lucas's car came around the bend, I shined a high-powered spotlight directly into his windshield from the trees. It blinded him. He slammed on the brakes, but the road was slick. He skidded. He hit the mannequin. To make it worse, we recorded the sound of a heavy, fleshy impact and played it over a loudspeaker hidden in the brush. It sounded incredibly real. The sheer cruelty of it made the breath catch in my throat. Lucas, my sensitive boy who used to play the cello to soothe the neighborhood's stray cats, would have been completely shattered. "He jumped out of the car, completely hysterical," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, guilt-ridden whisper. "He ran over to the body. Before he could realize it was plastic in the dark and the rain, Chloe pulled up behind him. She acted like she had just been driving by. She screamed. She grabbed him, told him he couldn't touch the body, told him he'd ruined his life. And then I stepped out of the woods. You, I said, the final pieces of the atrocity falling into place. I was dressed in a dark suit. I told them I was a private cleaner, someone who makes problems go away for a price, Julian confessed, looking down at his muddy shoes. I grabbed Lucas by the collar. I told him I saw the whole thing. I told him the man he just killed was named Arthur Pendleton. I made up a whole life for him on the spot. I said Arthur was a senior accountant, a father of 3. I told Lucas the police would find his paint on the bicycle, that he was looking at 20 years for vehicular manslaughter and fleeing the scene. You tortured him, I whispered, the rage inside me vibrating so intensely I could barely stand still. You made him believe he was a murderer. He was in shock, Mrs. Evelyn. Complete clinical shock. He couldn't even stand up. He was just sitting on the wet asphalt, crying, begging me not to call the cops. That's when Chloe played the savior. Julian looked up, his eyes begging for a sliver of understanding he would never receive from me. Chloe told him she had a safe place. She told him she had secretly built a subterranean storm shelter for her delicate plants that the city didn't know about. She said I would dispose of Arthur Pendleton's body and the bicycle if she paid me, but Lucas had to disappear immediately so the police couldn't question him. She told him to get into her car, that she would hide him in the bunker just for a few weeks until the investigation cooled down. A few weeks, I repeated, my tone utterly devoid of warmth. That was the plan, Julian cried out, his voice cracking. That was what she told me. She paid my $60,000 crypto debt the next month, just like she promised. I thought she was going to let him out eventually. I thought she'd tell him the police closed the case and he could run away to another state. But then a year passed, then two. She started making me buy the supplies, the bulk food, the razor blades. She told me if I ever breathed a word, she would release the hidden recordings of me extorting Lucas, and I'd go to prison for kidnapping and fraud. He collapsed against the edge of the kitchen island, burying his face in his hands. She said he was working for her down there, making those little wooden houses for her terrariums. She said the business was booming and we couldn't stop now. I was trapped, Mrs. Evelyn. For 9 years, I have lived in absolute terror of her. You were not trapped, Julian, I said, my voice slicing through the air like a surgical blade. You were bought. You traded my son's life, his sanity, and 9 years of his youth for $60,000. You are not a victim. You are a warden. Julian didn't argue. He just sobbed, eating a pathetic, broken sound that offered me absolutely no satisfaction. From the distance, the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens began to cut through the sound of the Portland rain. The shrill noise grew steadily louder, echoing through the dark, wet streets of the suburbs, approaching rapidly. Julian's head snapped up. He looked toward the front windows, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He didn't run. He just stood there, his shoulders slumping in total, crushing defeat. They're coming, he whispered. Yes, they are, I said, stepping past him to unlock the front door. I looked back at him, my expression unyielding. You will tell them exactly what you told me. You will give them the fake name, Arthur Pendleton. You will confess to the crypto debt, the mannequin, and the extortion. And if you try to minimize your role, I will make sure the prosecutor knows you have been running midnight smuggling operations for nearly a decade. I'll tell them, Julian surrendered, closing his eyes as the flashing red and blue lights began to dance across the rain-slicked walls of my kitchen. I'll tell them everything. Just, please get him out of there. I turned away from the man who had helped destroy my family. I pulled the heavy wooden front door open, stepping out onto the porch to meet the convoy of police cruisers tearing into the driveway. The time for gathering the poison was over. The amputation was about to begin. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers fractured the heavy Portland rain, casting wild, rotating shadows across the wet grass of the estate. I stood on the front porch, in the freezing wind whipping at my raincoat, as doors slammed and heavily armed officers poured onto the driveway. Julian was still kneeling on the kitchen floor where I had left him, sobbing into his hands. He didn't even lift his head when 2 officers stormed into the house and aggressively pinned his arms behind his back, reading him his rights before dragging him out into the storm. A tall woman in a dark tactical jacket stepped out of the lead cruiser and approached me. Her badge gleamed under the porch light. Mrs. Vance, I am Police Chief Sarah Jenkins. The dispatcher relayed your call. You said your son is trapped on this property? He is in a concrete bunker beneath the greenhouse, I said, my voice eerily steady, the 40 years of emergency room trauma control acting as an impenetrable shield around my shattering heart. The entrance is exposed. I have the passcode. Follow me. I didn't wait for her permission. I turned and marched through the pouring rain, leading Chief Jenkins and a team of 4 tactical officers around the side of the grand house. The greenhouse glowed faintly in the darkness, a massive glass structure hiding an unimaginable sin. I pushed the heavy door open, and the officers flooded inside, their high-powered flashlights sweeping over the exotic ferns, the terrariums, and finally, settling on the raised concrete dais at the back. Chief Jenkins stared at the massive mahogany planter that had been rolled aside, her tactical light reflecting off the dull gray steel of the heavy industrial hatch embedded in the floor. The lock is biometric and digital, I told her, stepping up onto the dais. But the planter's movement disengaged the primary deadbolt. The hatch is simply heavy. It needs to be manually breached. Jenkins nodded to her officers. Pry it open, now. 2 officers stepped forward with heavy steel crowbars. They wedged the iron tips into the microscopic gap between the steel hatch and the concrete floor. With a coordinated, agonizing grunt of exertion, they leaned back with all their weight. The heavy steel groaned, a horrific metallic screech that echoed violently against the glass ceiling of the greenhouse. The hatch gave way, swinging upward on massive hidden hinges, and slammed backward onto the concrete. The smell hit us instantly. It was a suffocating, dense wall of odor that physically forced the officers to take a step back. It was not the smell of damp earth or blooming orchids. It was the sharp, choking scent of airborne sawdust, wood glue, and industrial chemical toilets, mingled with the unmistakable stale musk of recycled, unventilated air. It smelled like a tomb that had been occupied by a living ghost. A steep steel ladder descended into the black void. Chief Jenkins drew her sidearm and clicked on her shoulder light. "Portland Police!" she shouted down into the darkness, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "We are coming down. Stay exactly where you are." She descended the ladder quickly, followed by 2 of her officers. Protocol dictated that I wait above, that the perimeter be secured before civilians were allowed into a potential crime scene. But I was not a civilian. I was an ER nurse, and more importantly, I was a mother who had waited 9 years, 3 months, and 12 days to see her son. I grabbed the cold steel rungs of the ladder and climbed down into the abyss right behind them. The bunker was a 20 by 15-foot concrete box, exactly as the Idaho contractor's invoice had detailed. The officers swept their lights across the room, eventually finding a switch that flickered on a row of harsh, buzzing fluorescent overhead panels. The brutal white light illuminated a nightmare of profound, suffocating isolation. To my left was a narrow, metal-framed cot with a thin gray blanket. In the corner sat a portable chemical toilet and a tiny stainless steel utility sink. But it was the rest of the room that stole the breath from my lungs. Every single inch of the concrete walls, the floor, and the small wooden desk in the center was covered. There was a thick layer of fine balsa wood dust coating every surface. Hundreds of tiny, intricate wooden carvings, miniature gazebos, microscopic bridges, tiny clay houses were piled haphazardly in plastic bins, and scattered among them, plastered to the concrete walls with bits of tape, were papers. Hundreds and hundreds of torn scraps of paper, old receipts, and the backs of supply invoices. Upon closer inspection, every single scrap was covered in hand-drawn musical staves, intricate, frantic, desperate musical notes composed with pieces of charcoal and stubby pencils, an endless, chaotic symphony written by a man who had not touched a cello in nearly a decade. And there, huddled in the far corner between the cot and the wall, shielding his eyes from the sudden, blinding glare of the fluorescent lights, was my son. I pushed past the officers. My knees hit the concrete floor hard, tearing the fabric of my slacks, but I felt absolutely nothing. "Lucas," I choked out, a sound that was half sob, half prayer. He lowered his arm slowly, his eyes wide, terrified, and unaccustomed to the light. He was 30 years old now, but he looked so incredibly fragile. His dark hair was long, matted, and tangled around his shoulders. A thick, unkempt beard covered the lower half of his face. His skin was shockingly pale, possessing the translucent, sickly pallor of someone suffering from severe, long-term vitamin D deficiency. He wore an oversized, faded gray sweatshirt and large gray sweatpants, but it was his hands that broke me. As he reached out toward me, trembling violently, I saw the deep, jagged scars crisscrossing his knuckles and fingertips. Calluses built upon calluses, the permanent. A brutal damage of a man forced to carve microscopic wooden structures with sharp blades in terrible lighting, day after day, year after year. Mom? His voice was a raspy, broken whisper. It sounded like sandpaper grinding against dry wood. I'm here, baby, I wept, throwing my arms around his frail shoulders, pulling his head against my chest. He felt impossibly thin, his collarbones sharp against my jacket. I am right here, Lucas. I've got you. It's over. He clung to my coat, his scarred fingers digging into the waterproof fabric with a desperate, terrifying strength. His whole body shook with violent, concussive sobs. Mom, I can't leave, he babbled frantically, his mind clearly trapped in the psychological cage Chloe had built for him. The police, they're here. Arthur Pendleton. I killed him, Mom. And I hit him on the Gorge Road. Chloe said if I leave this room, they'll lock me away forever. I'm a murderer. You are not a murderer, Lucas, I said fiercely, gripping his face in my hands, forcing his panicked eyes to meet mine. There was no Arthur Pendleton. It was a mannequin, Lucas. It was fake blood, Julian confessed. Chloe lied to you. She lied to all of us just to steal your money and your art. You are completely innocent. He stared at me, his hollow eyes blinking as my words fought to penetrate 9 years of systematic brainwashing. A choked gasp escaped his lips, and he buried his face back into my shoulder, weeping with the profound, exhausting release of a man whose soul had just been unchained. Above us, heavy, frantic footsteps echoed on the metal rungs of the ladder. What is going on here? Get out of my greenhouse! The voice was shrill, panicked, and filled with a desperate, indignant rage. I turned my head, keeping my arms tightly wrapped around Lucas. Chloe stumbled off the bottom of the ladder and practically fell into the bunker. She was wearing a pair of expensive emerald green silk pajamas. Her hair was disheveled, her perfect makeup completely absent, revealing the pale, terrified face of a woman whose empire was burning to the ground. She stared at the armed police officers, at the breached hatch, and finally at me, kneeling on the sawdust-covered floor, holding the brother she had buried alive. For a fraction of a second, absolute horror washed over her features, but then the sociopathic mask slammed back into place. Mom, step away from him, Chloe ordered, her voice trembling but attempting to project authority. She looked at Chief Jenkins. Officer, you don't understand. He is dangerous. He killed a man 9 years ago in a hit and run. I've been keeping him down here to protect our family. I've been feeding him, taking care of him. I saved his life. Chief Jenkins didn't blink. She holstered her flashlight and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. Chloe Vance, you are under arrest for kidnapping, false imprisonment, grand theft, and extortion. You can't do this, Chloe shrieked, backing against the cold concrete wall as 2 officers grabbed her arms, spinning her around. I gave him everything. I gave him a purpose. I kept him safe from the world. He owes me. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the small concrete room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I held my son tighter, looking up at the daughter I had raised, the daughter I had trusted, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, infinite void where my love for her used to reside. Take her out of my sight, I told Chief Jenkins, my voice echoing off the walls of the bunker, and get an ambulance for my son. We are going home. The transition from the suffocating, sawdust-heavy air of the bunker to the sterile, clinical brightness of the Oregon Health and Science University Hospital was a blur of sirens and stinging rain. Lucas had been transported in a specialized ambulance, his body shielded by heavy blankets and his eyes covered with a silk sleep mask to protect his retinas from the sudden exposure to light. And I sat in the high-back plastic chair in his private observation room, my nursing background allowing me to navigate the chaos of IV starts, blood draws, and heart monitors with a cold, focused efficiency. The room smelled of ozone and industrial floor cleaner, a sharp contrast to the damp earth of the greenhouse. Lucas lay in the center of the adjustable bed, looking smaller than I remembered. Without the shadows of the bunker, his skin appeared almost translucent, a sickly parchment color that revealed the blue map of his veins beneath. His hands, the hands of a master whittler and a cellist, were resting on the white cotton sheets, still trembling. Chief Jenkins stood by the window, her silhouette dark against the neon glow of the Portland skyline, her radio crackling occasionally with updates from the crime scene at the estate. As the sedative the doctors administered began to wear off, Lucas's breathing turned shallow and panicked. He clawed at the air, his eyes darting wildly toward the heavy oak door of the hospital room. "Mom," he gasped, the sound raw and desperate. "You shouldn't be here. You have to tell them. You have to tell the officers to take me to the station. I can't stay in this bed while a family's out there grieving. I killed him. I killed Arthur Pendleton." I moved to the side of the bed, taking his scarred hands in mine. "Lucas, listen to me. Breathe. You didn't kill anyone." "I did," he shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed off the sterile white walls. Tears streamed down his face, soaking into the thin hospital pillow. It was the night of the storm. I felt the impact. I heard his bones break against my bumper. Julian said he was a father of 3. He said his name was Arthur Pendleton, a senior accountant from Seattle. I saw the blood on the road, Mom. It was everywhere. I've lived with that blood on my soul for 3,000 days. Please, just let them arrest me so I don't have to hide anymore." Chief Jenkins stepped forward, her expression unyielding, but not unkind. She held a tablet in her hand, the screen glowing with a series of official documents. "Lucas, look at me," she commanded. Her voice had the authority of a woman who had spent 20 years chasing the truth through the darkest corners of the city. Lucas turned his head slowly, his hollow eyes blinking in the harsh fluorescent light. "I have been on the phone with the Seattle Police Department and the Washington State Department of Licensing for the last 3 hours, Jenkins said, tapping the screen of her tablet. "I ran a comprehensive search for every Arthur Pendleton in the Pacific Northwest. There is only one. He is 53 years old. He is indeed a senior accountant, and he lives in a quiet suburb of Seattle." She turned the tablet so Lucas could see the screen. It displayed a recent social media photograph of a middle-aged man standing in a sunny backyard holding a golden retriever. He looked healthy, happy, and very much alive. Mr. Pendleton was never in a car accident in November of 2017, Jenkins continued. "In fact, I spoke to him 20 minutes ago. He has never owned a bicycle in his life. He was at a corporate retreat in British Columbia on the night you think you hit him. The entire story, the name, the profession, the family, was a fabrication created by your sister and Julian to keep you in a state of perpetual terror." Lucas stared at the image of the man on the screen, his mouth falling open. A low, guttural moan escaped his throat, a sound of such profound confusion and relief that it made my heart ache. But the blood, the impact, I felt it. "It was a mannequin, Lucas," I whispered, leaning in close. "Julian confessed. He used theatrical blood and a spotlight to blind you. The sound was played over a loudspeaker. They played with your mind because they knew how much you valued human life. They used your own goodness to build your prison." The silence that followed was heavy, yet broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Lucas's pulse was slowing down, the frantic spikes on the screen leveling out as the weight of 9 years of guilt began to evaporate. But Chief Jenkins wasn't finished. She pulled a physical folder from her tactical bag and laid 2 documents on the overbed table. "There is one more thing, Lucas. Something that proves the premeditation of this crime," she said. She pointed to the first document. This is a bill of sale for your 2015 Subaru Crosstrek. It is dated November 24th, 2017, exactly 10 days after you were moved into that bunker. The car was sold to a private dealership in rural Idaho for $4,000 in cash. The dealership's records show the seller claimed you had moved to Europe and needed a quick sale. She then pointed to the second document. She had a photocopy of the seller's signature. This is the signature on that bill of sale. It says Lucas Vance. It looks remarkably like your handwriting at a glance. The loops of the L, the slant of the V. It's a very high-quality imitation. Lucas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the ink on the page. I never signed that. I was in the dark. I didn't even know where my keys were. We know, Jenkins said. Our forensic document examiner analyzed the signature an hour ago. Under microscopic magnification, there are tremors in the ink, what we call hesitation marks. It's proof of a slow, deliberate forgery. We also found a partial latent fingerprint on the original document that was missed during the initial transaction. It's a perfect match for Chloe Vance. She didn't just hide you, Lucas. She liquidated your assets, sold your vehicle to destroy the physical evidence of the accident, and forged your name to make it look like you had simply moved on with your life. I watched my son's face. The shock was being replaced by a burgeoning, icy clarity. For 9 years, he had worshipped Chloe as his savior, the only person standing between him and a life sentence in a state penitentiary. He had carved those intricate houses and written those desperate symphonies because he believed he owed her his life. And to see the physical evidence of her betrayal, the forged signature, the sold car, the living man he thought he had killed, was a violent psychological amputation. She sold my car, Lucas whispered, his voice gaining a hard, bitter edge I hadn't heard before. While I was crying in that sawdust, wondering if the man I hit had a favorite color, she was signing my name for $4,000. She used you, Lucas, Jenkins said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. She turned you into a revenue stream and a ghost. But that ends tonight. Julian is in custody, and Chloe is being processed as we speak. Neither of them will ever touch your life again. Lucas leaned back against the pillows, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The tears had stopped, replaced by a quiet, simmering resolve. He looked at his scarred hands, the fingers that had been forced to create beauty for a monster, and he slowly curled them into fists. I reached out and placed my hand over his. For the first time in nearly a decade, the air in the room didn't feel heavy with the scent of antiseptic or damp earth. It felt like the truth. You're free, Lucas, I said. The world knows you're innocent. And tomorrow, we're going to make sure Chloe never forgets what she did to you. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the photograph of the sunrise I had pinned to the wall earlier, his gaze steady. Tomorrow, he finally agreed, his voice stronger than it had been since the moment we pulled him from the earth. Tomorrow, I want to see the sky. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct's digital forensics lab hummed with a clinical, low-frequency buzz that grated against my nerves. It was 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, yet the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and stale adrenaline. I sat in a high-backed ergonomic chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring at a wall of monitors. Beside me sat Marcus Grant, a cybersecurity specialist with hollowed eyes and a sharp, analytical mind who had spent the last 6 hours dissecting the digital ghost of my son. Mrs. Vance, I need you to look at this, Marcus said, his voice flat and weary. He clicked a mouse, and a video file appeared on the center screen. It was a video I knew by heart. It had arrived in my inbox 3 years ago, on the anniversary of Lucas's disappearance. In the grainy, poorly lit footage, a young man who looked remarkably like Lucas sat in a nondescript room. He was wearing a dark hoodie, his face partially shadowed. Mom, I'm okay, the voice had said, sounding slightly distorted, as if recorded on a cheap burner phone. I just need more time. Please don't look for me. I love you. I had watched that 40-second clip 1,000 times. It was the only thing that had kept me from falling into a total abyss of despair. It was my proof that he was alive, wandering somewhere in California or Mexico, finding himself. Watch his eyes, Marcus commanded. He zoomed in on the pixelated face until the bridge of the nose filled the entire monitor. He slowed the playback to 10%. And look at the shadows around the jawline. As the video crawled forward, I saw it. For a fraction of a second, as the figure turned his head, the skin near his ear seemed to shimmer, a momentary glitch where the texture of the face didn't align with the movement of the skull. The shadows under the jaw lagged by a millisecond, creating a ghostly, translucent trail. This is a deep fake, Mrs. Vance, Marcus explained, his tone sympathetic but clinical. In 2023, the technology became accessible enough for anyone with a decent GPU and enough source material. And we found folders on Chloe's private cloud server containing over 800 hours of home movies of Lucas. She used those videos to train a neural network. She mapped Lucas's features onto a digital mask and then overlaid that mask onto footage of herself or Julian acting out the movements. He opened another program, displaying a series of audio waveforms. One was a clip from a family dinner in 2015. The other was the audio from the Mom, I'm Okay video. The voice was even easier, Marcus continued. AI voice cloning technology only needs about 10 minutes of clean audio to create a near-perfect replica. Chloe used a subscription-based synthesis service. She typed the scripts, the emails, the texts, the scripts for these videos, and the AI generated the audio. She then used a post-processing filter to add background noise, wind, or traffic, static, to hide the artificial, robotic cadence of the synthesis. I felt a cold, oily sensation wash over me. Every birthday message, every I'm safe email, every blurry video that had arrived to soothe my grief was a digital lie. Chloe hadn't just imprisoned Lucas. She had manufactured a digital version of him to keep me compliant. She had used his own face and his own voice to tell me to stop looking for him. The sheer, calculated depravity of it made my stomach churn. She had stood in my kitchen, watched me cry over these videos, and offered me a tissue while knowing she had rendered them on her laptop the night before. She timed them strategically, Marcus added, clicking through a log of sent messages. Every time you started talking about hiring a new private investigator or going back to the police, a new message would arrive. She wasn't just lying to you, she was managing you. She was using technology to keep the search dead. The digital forensics were a devastating blow, but the final physical link in the chain was waiting for us in the interrogation room down the hall. Police Chief Jenkins met me at the heavy steel door. We have him, Evelyn. Jake Morrison, the owner of Cascade Excavation. Through the one-way glass, I saw a man who looked nothing like a criminal mastermind. He was in his late 50s, his face weathered by decades of Idaho sun and manual labor. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work boots, his hands, thick and calloused, trembling as they clutched a paper cup of water. He looked broken. As Jenkins and I entered the room, Jake Morrison didn't even look up. He was staring at a photograph of the bunker entrance. The mahogany planter slid aside to reveal the steel hatch. Mr. Morrison, Jenkins began, her voice echoing in the small, sterile room. We've traced the $120,000 wire transfer from the Vance Trust Fund to your business account in October of 2017. We found the blueprints on your company's encrypted drive. You built a subterranean cage for a human being. Why? Jake Morrison's shoulders heaved, and a ragged, wet sob escaped his throat. He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a profound, soul-crushing guilt. She told me it was a storm shelter, Jake whispered, his voice cracking. I swear to Almighty God, that's what she said at the start. She said her mother was a retired nurse who was terrified of the increasing intensity of Oregon storms and that she wanted to surprise her with a high-end, soundproof bunker. She said her mother had sensory issues and needed the sound-dampening insulation to keep the thunder out. He took a shaky sip of water, his knuckles white. But then she started changing the specs. She wanted the steel hatch to only have a biometric lock on the outside. She wanted a chemical toilet and a recessed sink that could be shut off from the main house. She wanted an independent ventilation system that was silent and hidden. I'm a contractor, not a fool. By the second week of digging, I knew. I knew I wasn't building a storm shelter. I was building a prison. And yet you finished it, I said, my voice as cold as the concrete he had poured. You took the money and you walked away knowing a person would be put down there. Jake looked at me, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. My daughter, Sarah, she was 7 years old. She had a rare form of neuroblastoma. The insurance company had reached their cap. They were going to stop the experimental treatments that were the only thing keeping her alive. I needed $100,000 for the next round of trials in Switzerland. I didn't have it. I was a week away from losing my house. He leaned forward, his voice a desperate, pathetic plea. Chloe Vance. She knew. She had looked into my background before she hired me. She walked onto the job site one afternoon and handed me a duffel bag with $60,000 in cash as a down payment. She told me if I finished the job in 3 weeks, how while the homeowner was away on a long-distance nursing rotation, she'd wire the rest. She told me if I ever said a word, she'd report me for tax evasion and grand fraud, and I'd go to jail while my daughter died in a hospital bed. So you chose your daughter over my son, I said, the words tasting like iron. I did, Jake sobbed, burying his face in his hands. I took the money. I paid for the treatments. My Sarah is alive today because of that money. But for 9 years, every time I look at her, I see the face of the boy I buried in that hole. I saw the missing person posters online. I saw Lucas's face. I knew exactly where he was. I wanted to call, I wanted to tell, but I was a coward. I didn't want to lose my girl. The room was silent, save for Jake's ragged breathing. It was the final, devastating truth. For Chloe hadn't just used Julian's greed or Lucas's fear. She had weaponized a father's love for his dying child. She had scoured the Pacific Northwest for a contractor who was desperate enough to be bought and silent enough to stay bought. She had calculated the price of a human soul and paid it in full with Lucas's own money. You'll be charged as an accessory to kidnapping and false imprisonment, Jake, Jenkins said, her tone devoid of mercy. Your cooperation today will be noted, but it doesn't change the fact that you built the cage. Jake Morrison nodded, his expression one of total, hollowed-out defeat. I know. I'll take whatever comes. I'm glad he's out. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Vance. I'm so sorry. I didn't answer. I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the man who had built my son's tomb behind. I walked back to the forensics lab, where the digital ghost of Lucas was still frozen on the screen. Chloe had used every tool at her disposal, money, technology, and the primal desperation of others, to create a world where Lucas didn't exist. But as I looked at the shimmering, glitched face on the monitor, I knew the digital lies were over. The money was gone, the bunker was empty, and the man who built it had finally confessed. The only thing left was the trial and the final public dismantling of the monster I had called my daughter. The morning of the final sentencing arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that felt uncharacteristic for a Portland spring. The Multnomah County Courthouse was a fortress of gray stone and grim expectations, its hallways echoing with the hushed whispers of journalists and the rhythmic clicking of heels on polished marble. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my back straight, my hands folded tightly over a small wooden bird Lucas had carved in his first week of freedom. Beside me, Lucas sat shrouded in a dark suit that seemed to swallow his frail frame. He wore dark glasses to protect his sensitive eyes from the harsh overhead lights, his scarred fingers restlessly tapping a silent rhythm against his knee. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was electric, with a decade of accumulated tension. Chloe sat at the defense table, her once flawless poise replaced by a jagged, desperate energy. She was dressed in a conservative gray suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun, but the dark circles under her eyes told the story of a woman who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. Across the aisle, the prosecution team was a wall of cold, methodical precision. They had spent the last 2 weeks dismantling her life, brick by brick, exposing the financial fraud, the digital deceptions, and the sheer physical brutality of the bunker. The trial had been a grueling marathon of trauma. We had heard from Robert Vance about the stolen trust fund, from Margaret Higgins about the midnight supply runs, and from Jake Morrison about the construction of the concrete tomb. But the prosecution had saved one final devastating blow for the closing arguments. "The state calls Omar Bashir to the stand," the prosecutor announced. A murmur of confusion rippled through the gallery, and this was a name that had not appeared on any public witness list. A man in his early 50s, with weathered skin and a humble, nervous disposition, walked slowly to the stand. He took the oath with a trembling hand, his eyes darting toward the back of the room as if searching for an exit. "Mr. Bashir," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court where you were on the night of November 14th, 2017? Omar took a deep breath, his voice thick with a heavy accent, but clear in its conviction. "I was a delivery driver for a local bakery back then. I worked the graveyard shift. Around 1 a.m, I was driving my van up the Columbia River Gorge Road, taking the scenic route because the main highway was blocked by a mudslide." He paused, glancing briefly at Chloe, who had gone deathly still. "I pulled over at a scenic turnout to check my GPS. It was raining very hard. I saw a dark truck and a silver car parked on the shoulder about 50 yards ahead. 2 people were dragging something out of the truck. It looked like a body, limp and covered in something red. I thought I was witnessing a murder." "Why didn't you call the police that night, Mr. Bashir?" Omar looked down at his hands, his face flushed with a deep, long-held shame. "I was undocumented at the time. I had a wife and 3 young children at home. I was terrified that if I spoke to the police, I would be deported. I saw the woman, the defendant, and a tall man laughing as they positioned the body and a bicycle in the middle of the road. I realized then it was a setup, some kind of sick prank. I drove away and tried to forget it. I didn't know someone's life was being stolen. I didn't know about the boy in the basement until I saw the news last month. I couldn't live with the silence anymore." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his testimony settling over us like lead. It was the final nail in the coffin of Chloe's accidental narrative. It proved, beyond any shadow of a judicial doubt, that the entire event had been a calculated theatrical performance. When it was finally time for the defendant to speak, Chloe stood slowly. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with large theatrical tears. She began to sob, a high-pitched wailing sound that grated against the silence of the room. "Mom, you have to understand," she wailed, her voice cracking with a practiced desperation. "I did it for us. I did it to keep our family together." Lucas was going to leave. He was going to move to New York for a symphony position and leave us all alone in this giant house. After Dad died, I couldn't handle another person abandoning me. I created a world where he was safe, where he was protected from the world's cruelty. She turned toward Lucas, her hands reaching out as if to grasp him through the air. "I gave you everything, Lucas. I gave you a studio. I gave you a purpose. I used the money to pay off the mortgage on the estate so Mom would never lose her home. I used your talent to build a legacy for our family. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who took care of everyone while you were just going to walk away. It was a staggering display of sociopathic entitlement. She truly believed that her fear of abandonment justified 9 years of kidnapping. She believed that stealing her brother's life was a fair price to pay for her own financial and emotional security. Judge Sarah Montgomery, a woman known for her ironclad patience, finally leaned forward, her expression one of profound disgust. She slammed her gavel down once, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "That is enough, Miss Vance," the judge said, her voice vibrating with a cold judicial fury. "I have listened to your testimony for 3 days. I have watched you attempt to frame your brother as a murderer, a debtor, and a mental patient. And now I am watching you attempt to frame your own monstrous selfishness as an act of familial devotion." Judge Montgomery adjusted her glasses, her gaze piercing through Chloe's facade. "That love does not build concrete cages. Love does not forge signatures or create digital ghosts to silence a grieving mother. You did not keep your family together. You tore it apart and fed on the pieces. You treated your own brother as a commodity, a tool to be used for your own profit and vanity. You are a predator, Miss Vance, and the most dangerous kind, the one who hides behind the word family." The judge picked up the sentencing report, her jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. For the charges of first-degree kidnapping, 96 months. For false imprisonment, 60 months. For grand theft, 68 months. For extortion and criminal forgery, another 112 months. Given the extreme psychological cruelty and the length of the victim's suffering, these sentences will run consecutively. She looked directly into Chloe's eyes. "Chloe Vance, I hereby sentence you to 28 years in the Oregon Department of Corrections. Due to the heinous nature of your crimes and the risk you pose to the victims, there will be no possibility of parole. You will serve every single day of that sentence." The courtroom erupted. Chloe collapsed into her chair, let out a piercing, animalistic shriek of denied rage, and began to claw at her own face as the bailiffs moved in. They hoisted her up, her heels dragging against the floor as she screamed for me, for Lucas, for a mercy she had never shown. I didn't look back as they dragged her through the side door. I stood up, took Lucas's scarred hand in mine, and led him out of the courtroom. As we stepped out into the bright, the uncompromising sunlight of the Portland afternoon, the air felt different. It was hot, and it was heavy, but for the first time in 9 years, it was clean. The debt was paid, the monster was gone, and my son was finally, legally, and forever free. The salt air of the Oregon coast was a healing balm, a stark and necessary contrast to the stagnant, recycled oxygen of the bunker that had nearly claimed my son's soul. 8 months had passed since the night the Portland police breached the steel hatch beneath the greenhouse, and the world had shifted on its axis. We had sold the sprawling estate on Blackwood Drive within weeks of the trial. I couldn't stand the way the Doug firs cast long, skeletal shadows over the glass walls of the greenhouse, nor could I endure the hollow silence of a house that had held a prisoner for 9 years. We moved to a modern, open-concept apartment in Cannon Beach, a place defined by floor-to-ceiling windows and a constant, unobstructed view of the Pacific Ocean. Lucas had insisted on the light. He needed to see the horizon, to watch the sun dip below the waves every evening, confirming that the world was still vast and that he was still a part of it. The recovery was not a linear path. It was a slow, agonizing crawl toward the light. For the first few months, Lucas struggled with agoraphobia and severe sensory processing issues. The sound of a car backfiring or the sudden brightness of a midday sun would send him into a state of catatonic terror. But as his physical strength returned, so did his spirit. His skin lost its translucent pallor, taking on a healthy, sun-kissed glow from our daily walks on the beach. His scarred hands, once forced to carve microscopic lies for a monster, began to find their way back to his true calling. On a crisp October evening, the local community center in Cannon Beach was packed to capacity. The air was thick with the scent of driftwood smoke and the salt spray from the nearby shore. The audience was a diverse tapestry of survivors, men and women who had endured their own private bunkers of domestic violence, human trafficking, and profound psychological trauma. They were here for the premiere of Lucas's first original composition in nearly a decade. I sat in the front row, clutching a program that bore the image of a single bird breaking through a pane of glass. The title of the piece was printed in bold, elegant script, The Glass Ceiling. When the house lights dimmed, Lucas walked onto the stage. He moved with a slight, lingering hesitation, but his posture was upright and his head was held high. He sat down behind a beautiful, dark-stained cello, a gift from Maya and Stephen to replace the one Chloe had sold years ago. He closed his eyes for a long moment, the bow hovering over the strings, and then he began to play. The music was not the mournful, muffled vibration I had heard through the floor grates of the greenhouse. It was a soaring, defiant anthem. It started with low, discordant notes that mimicked the suffocating darkness of the bunker, the rhythmic tapping of a man losing his mind. But then the melody began to climb. It became a frantic, shimmering ascent, a sonic representation of the moment the steel hatch was thrown open. The music swelled into a powerful, heart-wrenching crescendo that spoke of sunlight, of salt air, and of the absolute, unyielding power of the truth. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the final note faded into the rafters, the silence that followed was not the heavy silence of a tomb, but the reverent silence of a shared victory. Then the applause broke, a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Lucas stood up, his face wet with tears, and looked directly at me. In that look, I saw the boy I had lost and the man he had become. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a witness. After the concert, we stood on the balcony of our apartment, wrapped in heavy wool blankets, as the tide roared against the rocks below. The lighthouse in the distance swept its beam across the dark water, a rhythmic reminder that even in the deepest night, there is a guide. "I didn't think I'd ever feel the weight of the bow again, Mom," Lucas whispered, his voice steady and clear. "I spent 9 years composing in my head, thinking the notes would die with me in that sawdust. To hear them out loud, it feels like I'm finally breathing." "You were always a musician, Lucas," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. "Chloe took your time, she took your trust, and she took your inheritance. But she could never take the music. That belonged to you." He looked out at the ocean, his scarred fingers tracing the wood of the balcony railing. "She's never getting out, is she?" "No," I replied, the word as cold and final as the judge's gavel. "She will serve every day of those 28 years. She chose her path, Lucas, and we chose ours." We stood there for a long time, watching the stars emerge through the thinning clouds. I thought about the 3 chances I'd been given to see the truth: Marcus's hearing, Margaret's notebooks, and Maya's discovery of the hidden signature. I thought about how close I had come to ignoring them all, to letting my desire for a quiet retirement and my blind trust in my daughter keep my son in the dark until he faded away. I have learned that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves to maintain our comfort. I spent 40 years as a nurse saving lives in the ER, but I almost failed the most important patient of my life because I was afraid of the trauma under my own roof. I let Chloe's success and her perfect smile act as a blindfold, and I will live with that regret for as long as I live with the joy of Lucas's return. As I look at my son now, standing tall against the Oregon wind, I realize that our story is not just one of tragedy, but of a terrifying, necessary awakening. Revenge was never my goal. Justice and liberation were the only things that mattered. I am sharing this story because I need you to understand that the people we love are capable of the unthinkable, and that our instinct to protect them can sometimes be our greatest weakness. Love, if it lacks the courage to look at the shadows, is not a sanctuary. It is a cage. If love is not paired with a fierce, uncompromising vigilance, it can inadvertently become the very thing that imprisons the ones we cherish. My daughter used the word family as a weapon, and I used it as a shield. We were both wrong. Family is not a reason to hide the truth. It is the reason the truth must always be told, that no matter how much it burns. If this story has moved you, if it has caused you to look a little closer at the quiet corners of your own life, then our pain has served a purpose. Do not ignore the rhythmic tapping in the dark. Do not dismiss the warm coffee mugs that shouldn't be there, or the "I'm okay" messages that sound a little too robotic. Trust your gut. Trust the whispers that tell you something is wrong. Please, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Knowing that Lucas's music and our journey have reached you reminds us that we are not telling this story alone. Share this with someone who needs the strength to open their own eyes. Subscribe and stay with us, because there are so many more stories of resilience and truth that need to be heard. Be vigilant, be brave, and above all, protect the ones you love with a heart that is wide open, but eyes that are never, ever closed. Take care of each other.